They were children, unseen, unheard, and easy to ignore. Behind closed doors, their cries vanished into police files that gathered dust. But one woman refused to let their stories die, and when she pulled back the curtain, the truth was more damning than anyone dared imagine. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones even through layers of fabric. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder than usual, echoing off the tiled walls of the evidence room. Rows of metal shelving loomed like silent sentinels, each holding the remnants of crimes long past, sealed bags of clothing stained with dark patches, swabs and sterile tubes, and small cardboard boxes with dates and numbers scrawled in black marker. The officer on duty that afternoon moved methodically, ticking off items from his clipboard. To him, this was a tedious but necessary ritual, a quarterly audit of exhibits stored in freezers, each containing samples destined either for court or for destruction. His pen scratched across the paper in a steady rhythm until it stopped. He'd reached freezer 46. Its lid resisted at first, creaking open with a hiss of frozen air that made him shiver. His gloved hands burrowed past layers of ice, sliding over the smooth surfaces of sealed plastic containers. Then he felt something different, heavier, more solid, more human. He pulled it free, and for a moment, the condensation obscured its contents. As he wiped the frost from the bag, the outline became horrifyingly clear. A small, lifeless form. The label was blunt. Aborted fetus. He almost dropped it. The reality of what he was holding. Not evidence of theft, not a trace of narcotics, but the remains of a child, slammed into him. His training told him to log it, to make the call, but his instincts screamed something else. This was no ordinary exhibit. This was the spark that would ignite one of the largest and most disturbing criminal investigations in British history. An investigation that would rip the lid off a conspiracy of silence, expose a network of men who preyed on vulnerable children, and force the nation to confront an uncomfortable truth it had ignored for far too long. It would become known as the Rochdale grooming scandal. But that was still years in the future. Long before the headlines, before the political debates, before the documentary crews and the trials, there were the streets. Rows of terraced houses where satellite dishes clung to bricks like barnacles, their windows draped with net curtains. Fast food takeaways with neon signs blinking against the gray drizzle. Bargain shops with hand-painted boards promising the cheapest prices in town. This was a place where opportunity was scarce, but temptation was cheap. For those at the bottom of the social ladder, kids from broken homes, runaways, those already failed by the system, the streets offered both a playground and a hunting ground. Some predators were obvious. The man who lingered too long outside the school gates, the one with a smile that never reached his eyes. But the men who would later be unmasked in Rochdale? They were different. They hid in plain sight, running takeaways, minicab offices, small shops. They were polite to adults, often generous in public, but behind closed doors they exploited the very children the community should have protected. The victims were almost always young teenage girls, some as young as 13. Girls who were desperate to feel grown up, desperate to be noticed. They were flattered with attention, given gifts, alcohol, drugs, and in return, their abusers demanded loyalty, silence, and, eventually, their bodies. At first, their stories were whispers, half-believed confessions to social workers, scraps of information passed between overstretched police officers, teachers who noticed a change but didn't know what to do. "They won't believe you," some of the men told the girls. "You're just troublemakers. No one will care." And in those early days, the predators were right. Too often, the girls were dismissed as consenting, as if a child could consent to being raped. Too often, police reports were shelved. Too often, the system decided these were not victims but problem children, out of control, promiscuous, or wasting police time. But every system has its cracks. And through one of those cracks would step a woman who refused to look away. Maggie Oliver didn't fit the stereotype of a rookie officer when she joined Greater Manchester Police in the late 1990s. She was older than most new recruits, a mother of 4, with life experience that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She'd seen hardship, she'd seen injustice, and she carried a quiet conviction that the job wasn't about quotas or headlines. It was about protecting the vulnerable. She started on the front line, walking beats through some of Manchester's most volatile districts. Moss Side was her baptism of fire, a place where gunshots sometimes punctuated the night and where the community's mistrust of the police was bone deep. But Maggie had a gift. She listened. She didn't rush to judge. And because of that, people began to talk to her. Not the way they talked to most officers, but the way they spoke to someone who actually gave a damn. She didn't know it then, but those skills would one day put her on a collision course with one of the most entrenched, uncomfortable truths in modern British policing. And she would be forced to choose, her job or her conscience. The path to that choice would begin with a single case, one girl's story, that would set the pattern for dozens more. The girl was in her mid-teens, with the restless energy of someone who'd already seen too much of life. She'd been going missing for days at a time, picked up by police in the company of older men, often smelling of alcohol, her clothes rumpled. She told officers she'd been at parties, that she'd been given vodka, cannabis, sometimes cash. What she didn't say, at least not at first, was that she'd been raped. Not once, not by one man, but by a group over and over. When she finally told her story, it was raw, halting, and full of details no child should know. Names of men who ran shops and takeaways. Descriptions of rooms above restaurants, cars parked in back alleys. The same details that other girls, completely unconnected to her, would later repeat. For some in the system, her story was just another in a long list of child-at-risk cases. But for Maggie Oliver, it was a warning siren. Every predator counts on silence. Every abuser knows the system's blind spots. And in Rochdale, at the turn of the millennium, those blind spots were vast. But cracks were forming. The discovery in Freezer 46 was just the first tremor. Bigger shocks were coming, because once one girl spoke, others would follow. And once their stories aligned, the picture they painted could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The question was, would anyone in power have the courage to act? The first time Maggie Oliver sat across from the girl in the interview room, she could feel the tension before a word was spoken. The room was windowless, the air stale, the only sound the soft buzz of the strip light above. On the table sat 2 paper cups of tea, both going cold. The girl's hands fidgeted in her lap, her nails bitten down. Every so often, she glanced at the tape recorder, as if weighing whether her voice should be on record at all. Maggie didn't rush her. Years of parenting had taught her that silence could be more persuasive than any question. When the words came, they were tangled, half-finished sentences, bursts of anger, sudden drops into whispered shame. She spoke about men who called her princess and babe, who bought her chips and cheap vodka, who told her she was beautiful. At first, she'd believed them. She was barely 14, still a child, and no one had made her feel special before. Then came the parties, the locked doors, the older men she didn't know by name, the nights she couldn't remember clearly, except for the pain afterwards. Maggie asked careful, open questions, logging details in her mind, locations, times, descriptions. She'd heard fragments of this before, from other officers, from social workers, from whispers on the street. But never so vividly, never so undeniably. And yet, Maggie also knew what might happen next. The file could be passed around, delayed, or quietly shelved. The girl could be labeled as unreliable or sexually active, language that conveniently shifted responsibility away from the men who had abused her. When Maggie raised the case with colleagues, some nodded gravely, others shrugged. "You know what these kids are like," one officer muttered over the hum of the station's vending machine. "Half the time they make it up. The other half, they don't want to press charges." It was an attitude Maggie had already learned to recognize. A mixture of cynicism, weariness, and, sometimes, quiet fear. Going after these offenders would mean stepping into a politically and culturally sensitive minefield. The majority of the suspects being named were of Pakistani heritage. The victims were white, working-class girls from chaotic backgrounds. It was the kind of demographic mix that made senior officers nervous. No one wanted to be accused of racism. No one wanted to inflame community tensions. And so, in the name of caution, action often stalled. But Maggie wasn't wired for inaction. She began making her own notes, meticulous, cross-referenced, building a timeline that linked one victim to another, one suspect to another. Patterns emerged. A takeaway on a busy high street where multiple girls said they'd been taken upstairs. A silver car that appeared in several accounts, parked in the same alley behind the bus station. The same first names, the same nicknames, repeated over and over. It wasn't random. It was organized. Her determination caught the attention of a handful of other officers who felt the same unease. Slowly, a small, unofficial network formed. People who would share information off the record, compare notes, and, when necessary, push cases forward without waiting for permission. It was dangerous ground. In a rigid chain of command system like the police, bypassing your superiors could end a career. But Maggie was already asking herself a different question. What's the point of the badge if you look the other way? Then, in late 2003, a breakthrough came, though it didn't look like one at first. A girl barely in her teens walked into a local health clinic. Distraught. She'd just learned she was pregnant. She named the father, a man in his 30s, and admitted he wasn't the only one she'd had sex with in recent months. Most had been older men. Medical staff, bound by safeguarding protocols, alerted social services and the police. This was no longer just a rumor or an anonymous tip. This was a child pregnant with a clear named suspect. When Maggie heard about the referral, she felt that familiar surge of adrenaline. Here was a chance to get evidence that could stand up in court, DNA from the baby, forensic examination, corroborating witness statements. But she also knew time was short. Pregnancies had a way of being quietly terminated before the full story could be told. She pushed for an urgent investigation. The interviews were harrowing. The girl described being picked up after school, driven to houses or flats where multiple men would be waiting. Sometimes she was given alcohol until she blacked out. Other times, she stayed conscious, watching the clock, counting the minutes until she could leave. She'd tried to tell people before. Teachers, a youth worker, even another police officer. But each time the reaction was the same. A raised eyebrow, a note in a file, and no follow-up. Now, sitting in that interview room, her voice was flat, almost resigned. She wasn't sure anything would change this time either. Maggie knew the next step. She needed to convince her own chain of command that this was worth the resources. That meant paperwork, meetings, and, most importantly, allies at a higher rank. She got enough to authorize the first steps of what would be called Operation Augusta. The goal was clear. Identify the men, gather evidence, protect the girls. But from the start, Augusta faced two enemies, the predators themselves and the inertia within parts of the system. There were delays in surveillance authorizations, arguments over budgets, endless debates about community impact. In the meantime, the men kept working, grooming new victims, intimidating old ones. For Maggie, each day that passed without arrests was another day those girls were at risk. She began to sense that if Augusta faltered, the whole ugly network might disappear back into the shadows for years. And she was right. The first operation would end not with the bang of high-profile convictions, but with a slow, quiet retreat. Files would be closed, cases marked no further action, and the men would walk free. But seeds had been planted in Maggie's mind, in the minds of a few other determined officers, and, though they didn't yet know it, in the minds of journalists who would one day turn this local scandal into a national reckoning. For now, though, the truth was still buried under paperwork, excuses, and fear, and the predators were still out there, smiling for their customers in the daylight, hunting in the dark. The meeting that sealed Operation Augusta's fate didn't make headlines. It wasn't even formally recorded in the way major decisions usually were. But for those in the room, it was clear. The momentum was gone. They sat around a rectangular table in a bland conference room, paper folders stacked at one end. Senior officers leaned back in their chairs, hands folded, eyes on the clock. The language was polite but heavy with subtext. "We've reviewed the available evidence," one said. "The resources required are disproportionate to the likely outcome," another added. "There are sensitivities we have to consider," a third concluded. On the surface, it sounded like a reasonable allocation of manpower. In reality, it was a withdrawal. Augusta was being wound down. For Maggie, it was like watching someone unplug a life support machine. She knew the victims' names, their faces, their stories. She'd seen the way some of them flinched when a certain car drove past, how others kept their eyes on the floor when questioned about boyfriends twice their age. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the men they'd identified wouldn't stop. When the official decision came through, it was framed as a strategic reprioritization. In plain English, that meant, we're walking away. Files were boxed and stored. Surveillance was halted. Contact with the girls dwindled to nothing. For many, it confirmed the lesson they'd already learned, that adults would listen, maybe even write things down, but nothing would change. Some of the girls drifted back to their abusers. Others ran away from home entirely. A few were moved into care homes, but even there, the men found ways to reach them. The network was patient, persistent, and unafraid. Inside the force, Maggie felt the ground shifting under her feet. She joined the police to protect people like these girls, but now she was being told, in effect, to forget them. She pushed back in the only ways she could, asking questions in briefings, requesting updates on cases that were closed, keeping her own off-the-record notes. It didn't make her popular. "You're too emotionally involved," one superior warned her. "That's exactly the point," she shot back. It was becoming clear to Maggie that too emotionally involved often meant asking the questions no one wants to answer. Away from the station, she carried the frustration home with her. She'd sit at the kitchen table after a shift, nursing a cup of tea gone lukewarm, replaying conversations with victims in her head. Norman, her husband, could see the toll it was taking. "You're not sleeping," he said one night. "How can I?" she replied. "I know they're out there, and I know exactly what they're doing. But in the world of policing, knowing and proving were two very different things. And proving meant getting the green light from people who had already decided the case was too much trouble." Months passed. New cases came and went, each demanding attention. But for Maggie, the memory of those girls didn't fade. She kept in touch with some of them, checking in unofficially, listening when they needed someone to talk to. What she heard was worse than she'd feared. Fresh names, new victims, stories that echoed the same patterns as before. It wasn't just that the abuse had continued, it had expanded. One girl told her, quietly, that she'd tried going to the police again. The officer she spoke to told her there was no case because she was choosing to see these men. She was 15. Maggie's stomach twisted when she heard it. This wasn't just negligence anymore. It was institutional blindness, the kind that allowed predators to operate in full view. Then, without warning, tragedy struck closer to home. One of the girls Maggie had worked with was found dead. The circumstances were murky, but those who knew her believed the years of abuse, neglect, and being disbelieved had crushed whatever will to keep going she had left. Maggie attended the funeral. It was a gray day, the kind where the air feels too heavy to breathe. She stood among a scattering of mourners, watching the coffin being lowered into the ground, and felt the sharp, unshakable thought. She should still be alive. If we'd done our jobs, she might still be alive. That night, she opened the battered notebook she'd been keeping since the early days of Augusta. She flipped through pages of scribbled names, dates, addresses, the map of a criminal network that had, for now, escaped justice. She didn't know it yet, but those notes would become the foundation for a fight that would one day drag the scandal into the public eye. For the moment, though, Maggie was still inside the system, and the system was making it clear that persistence came with a price. There were subtle hints. Being left out of certain meetings, being reassigned to cases far from her expertise, the occasional pointed comment about team players. It was a test, and soon, she'd be forced to choose between passing that test and keeping her integrity intact. The men of Rochdale thought they were untouchable. The truth was, for now, they were, but a storm was brewing. One that would take years to break, and when it did, it would shake not just a town, but the entire country. And Maggie Oliver, whether the institution liked it or not, would be at the center of it. After Operation Augusta was shut down, it was as if the whole thing had been erased from the force's collective memory. The case files were boxed up and stored in a secure archive. Officers were reassigned. No public statement was ever made. For the girls, it felt like abandonment. And in a way, they'd been encouraged to speak, to relive the worst experiences of their lives, to trust in a system that had promised protection. Now, there were no updates, no arrests, no court dates, just silence. Some lashed out, getting into trouble with the law themselves. Others turned to alcohol or drugs. A few disappeared from social workers' radar entirely. The men who had abused them carried on as before, emboldened by the lack of consequences. Inside Greater Manchester Police, the culture was to move on quickly. Failures weren't discussed. They were buried under the next pile of casework. Officers who'd been deeply involved in Augusta were quietly discouraged from revisiting it. Maggie Oliver refused to forget. She kept a mental list of the names that had surfaced during Augusta, both victims and offenders, and stayed alert for any mention of them in other cases. Sometimes she'd catch a reference in a briefing, a name linked to a minor assault, a drugs raid, a traffic stop. It was like spotting fragments of a puzzle scattered across the city. But without official backing, there was little she could do except watch. Years passed. Maggie took on other roles in the force, including work in child protection. The cases were often grim. Neglect, violent households, children taken into care. She built a reputation for tenacity and empathy, for treating victims as people rather than just entries on a caseload. Yet the memory of Rochdale never left her. She'd see a news item about grooming gangs in another town, Derby, Keighley, Oxford, and feel a knot tighten in her chest. She knew, without question, that what had happened in Rochdale was just as bad, maybe worse. She also knew something else. Eventually, the truth has a way of resurfacing. The first crack appeared in an unexpected place. A case involving two young girls from Rochdale, unrelated to Augusta on paper, but whose histories sounded hauntingly familiar. They'd been hanging around a group of older men, staying out all night, showing up at school with expensive new phones and clothes. Teachers raised concerns. Social workers filed reports. Eventually, police interviews began. In those interviews, the girls named men Maggie recognized instantly from her Augusta notes. It was as if the past had looped back on itself. She brought it up with colleagues, reminding them these names weren't new. "We had them years ago," she said. "We had enough to act, and we didn't." Some nodded uneasily. Others looked away. By now, public awareness of child sexual exploitation was growing, thanks to high-profile prosecutions elsewhere. In some quarters, that made it easier to push for action. In others, it hardened the resistance. Senior figures were wary of the political implications of exposing a network of predominantly Pakistani heritage men targeting white girls. The fear was that the far right would exploit the story to fuel racial hatred. The reality was that the truth was already dangerous, not because of who the offenders were, but because of who had failed to stop them. The renewed concerns in Rochdale eventually coalesced into a new investigation, Operation Span. This time, the focus was on a cluster of cases involving multiple victims and multiple offenders, with enough overlap to suggest an organized pattern. Maggie knew it was, in essence, Augusta reborn, but she also knew the stakes were higher now. The media was beginning to take interest. Politicians were starting to ask questions. Still, the old obstacles remained. Witnesses were reluctant to testify, terrified of retaliation or convinced nothing would come of it. Some had been through the system before and carried deep scars from being disbelieved. One girl told Maggie flatly, "Last time I spoke up, they made me feel like I was the criminal." It was hard to argue with her. Maggie threw herself into Span with the same determination she'd brought to Augusta. She revisited old contacts, re-interviewed victims, pieced together fresh timelines. But she also noticed a familiar pattern: the pressure from above to limit the scope, to focus only on the cases that were most likely to secure convictions. That meant narrowing the list of suspects, leaving out men who were known offenders but whose cases might be harder to prove. It was a strategy designed for courtroom success and for minimizing political fallout. But it also meant many abusers would once again walk free. Behind the scenes, Maggie's frustration grew. She could see that even when action was taken, it was only against a fraction of those involved. And she could see the damage it did to the girls who knew their abusers were still out there, unpunished. In quiet moments, she began to consider something she'd once thought unthinkable. What if the only way to get the full truth out was to step outside the police force altogether? The decision wasn't made yet, but the thought was there, hovering, waiting for the day when her conscience would force her hand. And that day was coming faster than anyone realized. By the late 2000s, Operation Span had gathered enough momentum and enough evidence to put a handful of men in the dock. It was a fragile achievement. Every step forward had been contested, delayed, or whittled down in scope. The victims were now young women, some in their 20s, but the abuse they were testifying about had happened when they were children. That gap mattered. Defense barristers would use it to attack their credibility, to paint them as unreliable witnesses dredging up ancient history. Maggie knew the women's accounts hadn't lost their truth with time. If anything, the years had made their courage even greater. But she also knew how the court system treated victims of sexual abuse, especially those with chaotic pasts. The cross-examinations would be brutal. The preparation for trial was relentless. Every witness had to relive their abuse in forensic detail, not just for the police, but for the Crown Prosecution Service and eventually in open court. Maggie sat with them in interview rooms, sometimes for hours, as they stumbled through memories that were part confession, part nightmare. They cried. They raged. Some went silent for long stretches, staring at the table as if the words were caught somewhere deep inside. Maggie never rushed them. She knew trust was fragile, especially after what they'd been through with Augusta, but she also knew time wasn't on their side. When the trial finally began in 2012, it attracted national attention. 10 men were charged, most of them from Pakistani backgrounds, all accused of grooming and sexually exploiting girls as young as 13. The prosecution's case laid out a grim, methodical pattern. The gifts of food and alcohol, the manipulation disguised as romance, the isolation from family and friends, the violent escalation into repeated rape. One girl described being so drunk she could barely stand, yet still being passed between men like an object. Another recalled being threatened with a lighter held under her chin if she tried to leave. It was all laid bare in court, with the victims' anonymity preserved but their dignity constantly under attack from the defense. The verdicts, when they came, were bittersweet. 9 of the 10 men were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 4 to 19 years. It was a victory, but a partial one. For Maggie, it was impossible to celebrate without thinking of the others who had escaped prosecution entirely. She knew there were dozens more offenders whose names had been in her notebooks for years. Many of them were still in Rochdale, still operating in the same circles. And she knew something else, that this was never just about the men in the dock. It was about a system that had allowed them to keep abusing for so long, even after the police and social services knew what was happening. In the weeks after the trial, official statements emphasized the hard work of the investigation and the bravery of the victims. Politicians praised the outcome. Headlines called it a landmark case. But behind closed doors, Maggie felt the hypocrisy. The same organization that had abandoned the girls during Augusta was now basking in the glow of convictions. There was no acknowledgement of the years of inaction, no apology for the harm caused by shutting down the first investigation. She tried to raise it internally, pushing for a review of how Augusta had been handled. Each time, the answer was some variation of, "That's in the past. Focus on what we achieved now." For Maggie, the past wasn't just a chapter to be closed. It was the root of the whole scandal, and ignoring it meant condemning future victims to the same fate. Her breaking point came when she realized that, even after the trial, many of the original suspects, men who had abused multiple girls, were still untouchable because their cases had been deprioritized years earlier. The victims knew it too. Some had seen their abusers in the street. Others had received messages through social media, subtle reminders that the men were still there, still watching. When one of the girls said to her, "What was the point of me going through all that if they're still out there?" Maggie didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like betrayal. It was then she began to make her decision. Staying inside the police meant accepting the limits imposed by the institution. Speaking out meant losing her career and possibly more. But every time she thought about staying silent, she pictured those girls in the interview room, the weight in their voices when they said no one believed them. She had joined the police to protect people like them. And if the only way to do that now was to turn whistleblower, then that was the path she'd take. The question was no longer if she would do it, but how and whether she could survive what would come next. Resigning from the police wasn't something Maggie took lightly. For years, the job had been part of her identity. The uniform, the oath, the sense of belonging to something bigger than herself. But the uniform had also become a weight. Every time she put it on, it felt like she was representing an organization that had failed the very people she'd sworn to protect. The morning she handed in her resignation letter, the station smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. She'd written the letter herself, short and direct, explaining that she could no longer serve in a force that had knowingly abandoned victims of serious sexual abuse. There was no flowery goodbye, no fond thanks for the memories. Just the truth. Her line manager barely glanced at it before folding it in half. "Is this really what you want?" he asked. "It's what I need," she said. Her voice didn't waver. Leaving the building for the last time was surreal. The automatic doors slid open, and she stepped out into the cold Manchester air. No one clapped her on the back. No one shook her hand. There was no leaving do, just silence. Driving home, she felt both lighter and more exposed. She'd cut herself free from the internal politics and constraints of the police, but also from its protections. Now, if she wanted justice for the girls, she would have to fight for it from the outside. The first step was finding people who would listen. Journalists had been circling the Rochdale story since the 2012 trial, but most had only scratched the surface. Maggie knew the deeper, darker truth, that the convictions represented a fraction of the abuse, and that the system had deliberately shut down an earlier investigation that could have stopped it years sooner. Through contacts, she met with a small group of reporters willing to dig further. The first meeting took place in a quiet cafe in the city center, away from prying eyes. Maggie brought her old notebooks, still dog-eared and full of the shorthand she'd used in Augusta. She laid them out on the table, page after page of names, dates, addresses. "These are the ones who never made it to court," she said. "Some of them are still out there. And here," she tapped another page, "these are the girls we failed." The journalists listened, their pens moving quickly. They'd heard rumors, but seeing the patterns laid out like that was different. It was undeniable. Still, Maggie knew that a story alone wasn't enough. Public outrage could flare and fade quickly unless it was anchored by pressure on those in power. So she began reaching out to campaigners, charities working in child protection, survivors of abuse who'd gone public, lawyers who understood the failures of the system. Some doors closed as soon as she mentioned Rochdale. Others opened cautiously. Everyone understood that naming the failures of the police, the CPS, and social services was risky. Careers could be destroyed. Lawsuits could follow. But slowly, a network began to form. People who'd seen similar failures in other towns, Rotherham, Oxford, Telford, recognized the same patterns Maggie described. The problem wasn't confined to Rochdale. It was national. The breakthrough came when a TV production company expressed interest in making a documentary. They wanted to tell the story through the voices of the victims themselves, but they needed someone credible to connect the dots and explain the institutional failures. Maggie was perfect for the role, not just because she knew the case inside out, but because she'd lived the moral conflict from the inside. She hesitated at first. Going on camera would mean putting herself in the firing line, from the force she'd left, from those who wanted the scandal buried, and potentially from the offenders themselves. But she also knew the power of seeing and hearing the truth directly from the people who'd lived it. If this helps even one of the girls feel heard, she told herself, then it's worth it. Filming began in 2013. Maggie sat in a bare interview room, this time as the one answering questions. She spoke plainly, without jargon, about Augusta, about the decision to shut it down, about the human cost of that decision. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. When the documentary aired, it caused a ripple that turned into a wave. Viewers were shocked not just by the abuse, but by the inaction of those meant to stop it. Politicians called for inquiries. Editorials demanded answers. For the first time in years, Maggie felt something close to hope. The truth was out there now in living rooms across the country. Couldn't be boxed up and filed away. But she also knew the fight wasn't over. Exposing the truth was one thing. Forcing those responsible to be held accountable was another. And she was just getting started. The night the documentary aired, Maggie stayed home, phone on silent, curtains drawn. She knew what was coming. The calls from journalists, messages from strangers, and the inevitable storm on social media. She'd sat in the edit suite weeks earlier, watching the finished cut, and felt her chest tighten. Seeing the girls, now young women, speak their truth on camera was powerful, but it was also raw. They weren't just telling their stories. They were laying bare the years of disbelief, the crushing weight of knowing that the men who'd abused them had been free for so long because people in authority had decided to walk away. The program pulled no punches. It named Operation Augusta, explained how it had been shut down, and made it clear that the decision had been taken even though suspects and victims were identified. Within minutes of the broadcast, her phone began to buzz. Texts, voicemails, emails. Some were from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Others were from complete strangers who wanted to thank her. A few were from victims of abuse in other towns who said, "This is my story too." By morning, the front pages were brutal. "Police abandoned abuse victims," screamed one. "Grooming gang could have been stopped years earlier," said another. Politicians were quick to demand answers. Backbench MPs called for a public inquiry. The Home Secretary's office issued a statement saying the revelations were deeply troubling and would be reviewed urgently. Maggie had expected pushback from Greater Manchester Police, and she got it. The official line was defensive, suggesting that the force had learned lessons and that the historical nature of the events made them difficult to investigate at the time. To Maggie, it sounded like the same excuses she'd heard inside the force years earlier. But this time, the public wasn't buying it. Within weeks, the mayor of Greater Manchester commissioned an independent review of Operation Augusta. The task was handed to a team of senior investigators from outside the force, with a mandate to examine exactly what had happened, why it had been shut down, and whether any of the offenders could still be prosecuted. For Maggie, it was vindication, the first official acknowledgement that Augusta's closure had been a serious mistake. But she also knew how these reviews could go. There was always the risk of a watered-down report, one that acknowledged failings without pointing fingers. She decided early on that she wouldn't sit back and hope for the best. If the review team wanted to know what happened, she'd give them everything: her notes, her emails, the whole unvarnished truth. Meeting with the review team felt different from talking to her old colleagues. These investigators weren't there to defend the institution. They wanted facts. She laid it out in detail: how victims had been interviewed and then abandoned, how key suspects had been named and then ignored, how the decision to shut Augusta down had been made at a senior level without considering the safeguarding implications. The investigators took it all in, scribbling notes, asking precise follow-up questions. Maggie left each session exhausted but cautiously hopeful. Meanwhile, the media firestorm didn't let up. More victims came forward, not just from Rochdale, but from towns across the country. Some had never spoken to the police before. Others had tried, only to be dismissed or disbelieved. Patterns emerged. The same grooming tactics, the same types of victims, the same reluctance by authorities to act decisively when offenders came from certain communities. It was becoming harder for politicians to dismiss Rochdale as an isolated failure. When the independent review's findings were finally published, they were damning. The report confirmed that Operation Augusta had identified at least 97 potential offenders and 57 potential victims. It concluded that the investigation had been prematurely closed and that the opportunity to safeguard children and bring offenders to justice was lost. The language was measured, official reports always were, but the meaning was clear. The decision to shut Augusta down had left children at risk. Reading those words in black and white, Maggie felt a mix of emotions: anger that it had taken so long, sadness for the lives damaged in the meantime, and a flicker of pride that she'd helped force the truth into the open. But she also knew something else. An official report was only the beginning. Reports didn't arrest offenders. Reports didn't put systems in place to stop the same thing happening again. And reports didn't erase the years of pain for the girls whose voices had been ignored. If anything, the review had thrown down a challenge to the police, to politicians, and to the public. Now that you know, what are you going to do about it? For Maggie, the answer was clear. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The review into Operation Augusta landed like a stone in still water. Sharp ripples at first, then a slow fading as the headlines moved on. For a few days, it felt like something might actually change. Politicians stood in front of cameras, pledging to learn lessons. Police leaders promised renewed commitment to protecting vulnerable children. But Maggie had seen this cycle before. Outrage, promises, then a quiet return to business as usual. She wasn't about to let that happen again. The reality was that Greater Manchester Police, despite the damning report, had no plans to reopen Augusta in full. They said resources were being prioritized for current cases. Translation: the past was still the past, even if some of the offenders named in Augusta's files were still walking the streets. In the weeks that followed, Maggie began receiving calls and emails from victims in other towns. They told stories that could have been photocopied from her old notebooks. Girls targeted in takeaway shops, offered alcohol and cigarettes, isolated from their families, then passed between groups of men. Rotherham, Oxford, Telford, Huddersfield. Each had its own name for the scandal, but the structure was the same. And in each, there were echoes of Augusta's failure. Reports ignored, victims disbelieved, predators protected by inertia and fear. Maggie realized that to fight this, she couldn't just keep pressing on Rochdale. She had to show that it was part of a national pattern. She began speaking at events, sometimes to small community groups, sometimes on bigger stages alongside survivors and campaigners. Her message was consistent. Grooming gangs thrived not because the police didn't know, but because they didn't act. At one event in London, she stood on stage holding a sheet of paper. On it were 20 names, not of offenders, but of police forces across England where grooming cases had been mishandled. "This isn't about one bad force," she told the audience. "This is about a culture that looks at certain victims and decides they're not worth the effort. And until we change that culture, these men will keep finding girls to exploit." Media appearances followed. Maggie learned quickly that if she wanted the message to stick, she had to be blunt. Television producers liked tidy sound bites, but she refused to soften her words. When asked why she thought the failures kept happening, she didn't dance around it. Because these victims are poor, they're vulnerable, and in too many cases they're seen as troublemakers. And because the offenders, in many towns, come from communities the authorities are scared to be seen targeting. It was a dangerous line to walk, honest without feeding into racist narratives. Maggie made it clear every time. The problem was not a whole community, but individuals exploiting both cultural and institutional blind spots. The pushback was inevitable. Former colleagues accused her of damaging the reputation of the police. Online trolls sent abuse, some laced with threats. But the messages from survivors outweighed the hate. One young woman wrote, "I saw you on TV. I didn't think anyone would ever believe what happened to me. Now I think maybe they will." Those messages became her fuel. Behind the scenes, Maggie began meeting with MPs who were willing to push for national change. Some wanted mandatory safeguarding reviews in every grooming case. Others talked about specialist units in every force dedicated solely to child sexual exploitation. She didn't care who got the credit as long as something concrete came out of it. "I don't want another apology," she told one MP. "I want procedures in place so the next girl doesn't spend years waiting for someone to care." But change was slow. The political appetite for tackling grooming gangs was high when the cameras were rolling, but in committee rooms and budget meetings, priorities shifted. Maggie refused to be a footnote in another forgotten report. If the institutions wouldn't move fast enough, she would keep telling the story over and over until they did. And each time she told it, she made sure to name the girls who had been ignored, not as statistics, but as human beings whose lives could have been different. Because if there was one thing she'd learned, it was this: The most dangerous thing for a predator is a victim who refuses to disappear. And Maggie Oliver was making sure those girls would never disappear again. After years of fighting from the outside, Maggie understood one thing clearly. Survivors were the most powerful force for change. Politicians could argue, police chiefs could spin statements, journalists could drop stories when the news cycle moved on. But when a survivor stood up and spoke, the room had to listen. So she began shifting her focus from just exposing past failures to actively building survivor-led advocacy. The first step was trust. Many of the women she reached out to had been burned before, by police who didn't believe them, by lawyers who dropped their cases, by media who sensationalized their trauma. She met them quietly, often in coffee shops or community centers. No cameras, no recorders, no pressure. "You're in control," she told them. "I won't do anything with your story unless you say so." Some conversations ended there. Others became the start of a journey. One young woman, Sarah Asterisk, had been just 14 when she was first targeted. She tried to report her abuse twice in her teens, only to be told by different officers that there wasn't enough evidence. Now in her 20s, she was still dealing with the fallout, depression, unstable housing, estranged family relationships. Maggie listened for nearly 2 hours before saying anything about the possibility of reopening the case. "If you want to try again, I can help you prepare," she said. "But only if it's what you want." Sarah agreed. Over the next weeks, Maggie helped her organize her memories into a coherent statement, track down old messages, and prepare emotionally for the interviews. When Sarah finally sat across from a new investigation team, she was ready. And for the first time, she felt like her voice mattered. Maggie's advocacy wasn't just about emotional support. It was tactical. She knew how cases could die in the procedural weeds, and she'd learned where to apply pressure. If a detective started dragging their feet, she could call a journalist she trusted. If a safeguarding board overlooked something, she knew which MP to alert. Her name carried weight now, both as a former detective and as a whistleblower. That didn't always make her popular, but it made her hard to ignore. In parallel, she was working the political front. She'd been building relationships with a handful of MPs who understood that Rochdale wasn't an isolated failure. They began pushing for national safeguarding reforms. Mandatory multi-agency reviews whenever police dropped a child sexual exploitation case. Specialist CSE units in every police force, ring-fenced from other duties. Survivor consultation panels so policies were shaped by lived experience, not just bureaucracy. The proposals sounded reasonable on paper, but Maggie knew how easily they could be watered down in committee rooms. She made a point of attending hearings, sitting in the public gallery when survivor testimony was being heard. Sometimes, she'd be there with 3 or 4 of the women she'd supported, a silent reminder to the panel that real lives were in the balance. Not everyone welcomed her presence. One senior police representative, speaking off the record, called her a troublemaker who enjoys embarrassing the force. Maggie didn't mind. "If the truth embarrasses you," she said in a later interview, "then maybe you should change the truth." The battles were exhausting. Meetings dragged on for hours, proposals got stuck in red tape, and there were days when progress seemed impossible. But then a survivor would send her a message saying, "They've reopened my case," and it was enough to keep going. By 2016, Maggie's role as an advocate was undeniable. Survivors sought her out directly. Journalists came to her first when new allegations broke. MPs mentioned her name in debates about grooming gangs and institutional failure. It was a long way from the day she'd walked out of Greater Manchester Police feeling like her career was over. She was no longer just the woman who blew the whistle on Augusta. She was the woman helping to change the landscape for survivors across the country. And in the years ahead, her fight would grow beyond the UK grooming gang scandal into a broader battle over how society treats victims of all forms of sexual exploitation. By the mid-2010s, Maggie Oliver had become a familiar face on British television. She was the former detective who'd exposed the failures in Rochdale, the whistleblower who'd put her career on the line for abused children, the straight-talker who refused to soften her words for the sake of diplomacy. Producers booked her for panel debates on current affairs programs. Breakfast news shows invited her to comment whenever a new grooming case broke. Documentaries sought her insight as a subject matter expert. In each appearance, she made sure to bring it back to the victims. Not just the ones in Rochdale, but the countless others whose stories were never told. She knew that the public's attention was fickle, and that the only way to keep pressure on the authorities was to keep these stories in the headlines. But media work came with a cost. Her public profile made her a target. Some criticism was predictable, from people who accused her of damaging the reputation of the police or stirring racial tension. Other attacks were more personal. Anonymous emails, abusive social media messages, and the occasional stranger who would approach her in the street, sometimes to thank her, sometimes to argue. The abuse didn't scare her so much as it wore her down. Advocacy work was already emotionally draining. Sitting with survivors through the retelling of their trauma, absorbing the weight of stories that never got easier to hear. Adding constant public scrutiny to that was exhausting. At home, friends urged her to take breaks, to switch off. Maggie found it hard. "If I switch off," she'd say, "someone else will decide the story's over." And it's not over. There was also the resistance she could feel from inside law enforcement. Some of it was subtle, police spokespeople who dismissed her as a former officer with her own agenda, or senior figures who made sure she wasn't invited to certain briefings. Other times, it was open hostility. In one radio debate, a retired police chief accused her of selectively remembering events to fit her narrative. Maggie held her ground, pointing out that his version of events didn't match the independent review's findings. She knew she was a problem for the institution because she didn't just talk about individual bad apples. She talked about structural failure. And institutions don't like being told they're broken. Still, the pushback only reinforced her conviction. If the police could be this defensive years after the fact, she thought, then reform was even more necessary than she'd realized. She kept working with survivors, expanding her network into other areas of sexual exploitation, cases involving boys as well as girls, and adult women who'd been trafficked. The patterns were familiar. Vulnerable people, predators who exploited gaps in safeguarding, and authorities who didn't act until the damage was irreversible. Maggie began to see her fight less as a single campaign about Rochdale, and more as part of a wider battle over how the UK protects or fails to protect the most vulnerable. But the bigger the fight, the heavier the toll. The media appearances, the survivor support, the political lobbying, it was a full-time commitment, yet it didn't come with a salary. Maggie was funding much of her work from her own pocket, doing consultancy when she could, but often working for free because she couldn't bring herself to walk away from people who needed her. There were days she wondered how long she could keep going like that. And yet, whenever she thought about slowing down, another survivor's call would come in. Another story would hit the news. Another police failure would be exposed. Stopping wasn't an option. Not while the same mistakes were still being made. By now, Maggie knew her advocacy had grown beyond what one person could manage alone. The requests for help were constant, emails from survivors, calls from journalists, invitations from schools, inquiries from MPs. It was impossible to be everywhere at once, and the work was too important to be left to chance. That was when the idea for the Maggie Oliver Foundation began to take shape. It wouldn't just be a charity with her name on it. It would be a dedicated space where survivors could get practical help, emotional support, and guidance through the maze of police procedures and legal processes. The aim was simple: to make sure no victim of sexual abuse was ever left feeling unheard or abandoned, the way so many had been during Augusta. Starting a foundation wasn't easy. Maggie had no corporate backers, no wealthy donors ready to underwrite her plans. But she had something more valuable: credibility and a network of people who trusted her. Survivors she'd helped were willing to share their experiences publicly. Journalists were ready to cover the launch. And supporters, ordinary people who'd followed her story, donated what they could. By the time the foundation formally launched, it already had a small but dedicated team of volunteers, many of them survivors themselves. That was deliberate. Maggie believed lived experience was the most powerful qualification for the job. The foundation began offering 3 key things: listening and belief, the first step for any survivor who came forward; practical advocacy, helping victims navigate police reports, safeguarding meetings, and court processes; campaigning for change, using case evidence to push for better policies and national standards. It didn't take long for the first success stories to emerge, cases where survivors, supported by the foundation, got the police to reopen investigations or secure safeguarding protections for their children. Meanwhile, Maggie's influence on national safeguarding policy was growing. She was invited to contribute to home office consultations on tackling child sexual exploitation. At roundtable discussions, she sat alongside police chiefs, social workers, and civil servants. She didn't waste her seat. In one meeting, after listening to half an hour of polite bureaucratic language, she cut in, "You're talking about learning lessons like this is a theory exercise. Out there are girls being raped tonight. What's your plan for them?" The room went quiet. That was her strength, refusing to let the urgency get lost in policy speak. But even in official spaces, institutional denial was never far away. Senior police figures still bristled when she challenged them. Some tried to reframe past scandals as regrettable misunderstandings, rather than systemic failures. Others argued that things are much better now, a claim Maggie would dismantle by citing fresh cases the foundation was handling. She knew her approach didn't win her friends in certain circles. But she also knew survivors didn't need her to be polite. They needed her to be relentless. By the end of that first year, the Maggie Oliver Foundation had supported dozens of survivors directly, influenced key safeguarding debates, and become a recognized voice in the fight against sexual exploitation. And for Maggie, it was proof of something she'd felt in her gut since leaving the police. That real change didn't come from inside the system. It came from challenging it, loudly, persistently, and without fear of making the wrong people uncomfortable. The fight was still uphill. But now she wasn't fighting alone. The Maggie Oliver Foundation hadn't been running long before it became clear that it was more than just a support network. It was also an early warning system. Survivors came to the foundation with recent cases, not just historic ones. Some were already in contact with police. Others had given up after being dismissed or told, "There's nothing we can do." Maggie and her team started to notice a chilling pattern. Despite years of public inquiries and promises of reform, the same failings that had shut down Operation Augusta were still happening. Reports of underage girls being targeted in certain areas were either downgraded to low risk or treated as isolated incidents. Evidence, like phone records or CCTV, was left uncollected. Victims who missed a single appointment were sometimes labeled uncooperative, and their cases closed without further follow-up. One case hit Maggie hard. A 15-year-old girl, we'll call her Emily, had reported being groomed by a group of older men. The police took an initial statement but failed to act for months. By the time Maggie heard about it, Emily had gone missing twice and was showing signs of severe trauma. When the foundation intervened, Maggie pushed for a full safeguarding review. Within weeks, new evidence was gathered and arrests were made. It was a success, but also a reminder of how close the system had come to failing another child. Maggie later said, "Emily's case was almost a carbon copy of what we saw in Rochdale. If we hadn't stepped in, she would have been just another statistic." These fresh failures made headlines. Journalists began to realize that the grooming gang scandal wasn't just a historic shame. It was a present danger. Some of them worked directly with the foundation, publishing detailed accounts that named police forces and councils still falling short. Every new article put pressure on those institutions to respond. Some grudgingly reopened investigations. Others launched internal reviews. Maggie knew they weren't doing it out of goodwill. They were doing it because public exposure left them no choice. But this constant firefighting came at a personal cost. Maggie was effectively on call 7 days a week. Survivors contacted her at all hours, sometimes in crisis, sometimes just needing someone to talk to. She tried to set boundaries, but it was hard. Many of these women had nobody else they trusted. Maggie knew what it felt like to be left alone in the dark, and she couldn't bring herself to ignore the messages. It took a toll. She had nights where she'd wake at 3 a.m., mind racing through half a dozen cases at once. She'd replay conversations in her head, wondering if she'd said the right thing, given the right advice, pushed hard enough. Friends worried about her. "You can't carry all of this," one told her over dinner. Maggie smiled, but she didn't argue. Deep down, she knew they were right, but she also knew she'd keep carrying it anyway. The Foundation's success meant more survivors were finding their way to her, and that was something she could never see as a burden. By now, the police knew exactly who she was and what her organization could do. Some forces began quietly cooperating, perhaps realizing that working with the Foundation was easier than being called out in the press. Others stayed defensive, treating her involvement as interference. Either way, Maggie was making them pay attention, and that, for her, was the point. By the time the Foundation was in full stride, Maggie had built strong connections with investigative journalists, the kind who didn't just run with press releases but went out into the field to find the truth. Some of them approached her with a new idea, collaborating on undercover operations to expose grooming gangs and institutional failures in real time. The goal was to document not just the abuse itself, but how authorities responded or failed to when credible evidence was placed in their hands. It was a dangerous step. Maggie knew undercover work came with legal risks and potential blowback. But she also knew that in some towns, predators were operating so openly it was as if they believed they were untouchable. One project began with anonymous tips about a group of men targeting teenage girls outside a fast food outlet. Maggie and the journalists quietly gathered witness accounts, CCTV stills, and even social media posts where the men bragged about pulling young ones. Instead of immediately going public, they first passed the information to the local police, documenting every interaction. What they wanted to see was whether the force would act quickly, or whether the evidence would languish in a file like so many times before. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. No arrests. No safeguarding measures for the girls. The journalists filmed every step of the delay. When the story finally aired, it was explosive. Not only did it expose the grooming, but it showed, in forensic detail, how a police force had failed to respond to credible warnings. The backlash was immediate. The police accused the program of compromising ongoing investigations. An investigation, Maggie pointed out, that had barely existed until the cameras got involved. Privately, some officers told her they agreed with her methods but couldn't say so publicly. Others were openly hostile, calling her reckless and accusing her of making the police's job harder. Maggie's response was blunt. "If you'd been doing your job in the first place, we wouldn't have to do this." These investigations weren't without personal risk. Maggie was now directly challenging not just institutional failures, but active offenders. She received anonymous threats, some vague, others chillingly specific. Friends urged her to be careful, to step back for her own safety. But the danger only reinforced her belief that what she was doing mattered. If exposing these networks made her a target, then it meant she was hitting the right pressure points. The undercover collaborations also had a secondary effect. They emboldened survivors and whistleblowers inside the system. Social workers, junior officers, even teachers began contacting the Foundation with inside information, sometimes about live cases, sometimes about cover-ups they'd witnessed. Maggie treated every tip carefully, verifying details before passing them to trusted journalists, or, where possible, to police officers she knew she could rely on. The work was now a delicate balance of public pressure, legal compliance, and survivor protection. It was high stakes, and it was exactly the kind of fight Maggie had been preparing for since the day she walked out of Greater Manchester Police. By this point, Maggie understood something that many still didn't. Grooming gang scandals weren't just a failure of policing, they were a failure of accountability. And if the system couldn't hold itself accountable, then it was up to people like her to do it from the outside, one exposed case at a time. Started subtly, a mention here, a quote there. MPs debating child protection in Parliament began to reference the work of campaigners, such as former Detective Maggie Oliver. At first, Maggie saw these nods as small victories. Every time her name was said in that chamber, it meant the issue wasn't being quietly shelved. But the mentions soon became more direct. Some MPs, frustrated by the lack of national coordination on grooming gang cases, began holding up her investigations as proof of ongoing failings. One backbencher, speaking during a home affairs debate, read out a section from a recent documentary Maggie had worked on. It detailed how a police force had failed to act on grooming evidence until public exposure forced their hand. This, the MP said, is why we need a formal national inquiry, not just into past scandals, but into current handling of exploitation cases." That speech made headlines. Maggie's phone lit up with messages from survivors and campaigners who felt, maybe for the first time, that Parliament was listening. But not everyone in Westminster welcomed her growing influence. Some MPs, particularly those aligned with police leadership, saw her as an unpredictable force, someone who could upend carefully negotiated policy compromises by going public with unflattering truths. There were whispers in the corridors that she was too close to the media or grandstanding for attention. Maggie knew the tone. She'd heard it before inside the police. It was the language of people who didn't want uncomfortable questions asked. Her response was always the same: "If you're more worried about my tone than the fact that children are still being abused, you're part of the problem." Behind the scenes, she began working with a small cross-party group of MPs who were serious about reform. Their goal was ambitious: a formal national inquiry into institutional responses to grooming gangs, with powers to compel witnesses and access sealed case files. Maggie provided them with anonymized case studies from the Foundation, showing that systemic failures weren't just historical, they were still happening. She also connected them with survivors willing to speak directly to lawmakers, knowing that first-hand accounts often cut through political hesitation better than any report. The push for an inquiry gained momentum, but it was a political tightrope. Some feared it could turn into a culture war issue, exploited by extremists to target entire communities. Maggie was careful, as always, to frame the problem in terms of individual criminality and institutional negligence, not ethnicity or religion. Even so, certain MPs avoided the issue entirely, worried about how it might play in their constituencies. Maggie had little patience for them. "You don't get to call yourself a public servant," she told one hesitant politician in private. "If you're picking and choosing which children you'll fight for." The campaign for a national inquiry wasn't a straight sprint. It was a grind of meetings, letters, and carefully timed media appearances. Maggie knew how to keep the story alive just enough to stop it slipping off the agenda, without letting it burn out in a single burst of outrage. It was the same skill she'd honed for years, turning short-term headlines into long-term pressure. And as whispers grew that the government might finally be considering a wide-ranging review, Maggie was already planning her next move, because an inquiry would only matter if it was built on truth, not political convenience. She'd spent too long watching official processes dilute reality into lessons learned soundbites. This time, she intended to make sure the full story stayed in the light. The closer the possibility of a national inquiry came, the more intense the behind-the-scenes negotiations became. Publicly, government ministers spoke in cautious but sympathetic tones, saying they were considering all options and listening to stakeholders. Privately, Maggie knew there were forces working to limit the scope before it even began. The pushback came from predictable quarters. Senior police representatives warned that an inquiry with full access to historic case files could damage operational capacity and divert resources from current investigations. To Maggie, those were the same tired phrases she'd heard for years: bureaucratic code for "we don't want you looking too closely." She also knew there was fear of accountability. A genuine, unfettered inquiry could expose not just individual failings, but entire chains of command that had looked the other way. For some retired officers, it could mean reputational ruin. For others still serving, it could mean career-ending scrutiny. Maggie's strategy was simple: make it politically impossible to water the inquiry down. That meant keeping survivor voices front and center. She began arranging for women supported by the Foundation to meet MPs in private briefings. These weren't grandstanding sessions. They were raw, often emotional conversations in which survivors described exactly how they'd been failed, sometimes naming the officers who'd ignored them. One meeting left a seasoned MP in tears. "I thought I understood the scale of this," he admitted to Maggie afterwards. "I didn't." Meanwhile, some in law enforcement tried a softer approach, inviting her to collaborative discussions that, to her ear, were really about persuading her to back a narrower inquiry. In one meeting at police headquarters, a senior officer leaned across the table and said, "Maggie, we're not your enemy, but if you push too hard, you'll lose the chance to get anything through at all." She didn't flinch. "If what we get isn't the truth, it's not worth having," she replied. "You've had years to put this right quietly. Now we're going to do it publicly." Her allies in Parliament knew the risks too. Some warned her that if the inquiry became too politically charged, it could be shelved entirely. Maggie countered that survivors had already lived through decades of political discomfort, and it hadn't saved them. Her approach was risky but calculated. She was betting that public opinion, once mobilized, would outweigh institutional resistance. At the same time, she was laying the groundwork for survivor involvement in the inquiry itself. She argued that without direct survivor testimony at its core, any review would be just another paper exercise. The foundation began training survivors who wanted to speak publicly, preparing them for the emotional toll, the media attention, and the inevitable cross-examination. "It's not about making you relive your trauma," Maggie told them. "It's about making sure the people who ignored you have to hear it, from you, in a room they can't walk out of." By now, the idea of a national inquiry was no longer a fringe proposal. It was a live political question. The debate had shifted from whether to have one to how far it would go. Maggie knew that was the most dangerous phase, the point where promises could be quietly diluted into something safe and forgettable. And she had no intention of letting that happen. It was a gray Tuesday morning when the announcement came. The Home Secretary stepped up to the lectern, flanked by 2 senior civil servants, and confirmed what campaigners like Maggie had been pushing for: a national inquiry into the institutional handling of grooming gang cases. The statement was careful, polished in that way only government press releases can be. The inquiry would be independent, comprehensive, and would seek to learn lessons to ensure such failings are never repeated. There was no mention of accountability, no promise of naming individuals. Maggie sat watching it on television, arms folded, reading between the lines. She'd fought too long to mistake warm words for hard action. Within hours, social media lit up. Survivors posted cautiously hopeful messages. Supporters of the foundation flooded Maggie's inbox with congratulations. News channels ran split-screen coverage, the minister's speech on one side, archive footage of protests, marches, and Maggie's own TV interviews on the other. But while the public mood leaned towards celebration, Maggie's instinct was different. She knew this was just the starting gun, and that the real danger was the inquiry becoming exactly what the institutions wanted: a slow, sanitized process that drained urgency out of the issue. The first signs of trouble came almost immediately. The inquiry's draft remit landed in her email 2 days later, and it was glaringly narrow. It focused heavily on historic cases and vague, systemic learnings, with little provision for investigating current failures. It also lacked explicit powers to compel testimony from serving police officers or to access certain classified files. Without those, Maggie knew, the most damning truths could remain buried under confidentiality. She got straight on the phone to her allies in Parliament. "If this stands," she told one MP, "it's not an inquiry, it's a PR exercise." In the media, she played a careful game. She didn't dismiss the inquiry outright. Doing so could alienate public goodwill, but she made it clear she'd be holding it to account. On one radio program, when asked if she was delighted by the announcement, she replied, "I'm pleased we've got this far, but an inquiry that doesn't have teeth is just a talking shop." Survivors deserve more than polite conversations about the past. They deserve the truth, and they deserve change now. Her words were clipped and deliberate, designed to make headlines without letting politicians box her in as either fully onside or completely hostile. Behind the scenes, she began mobilizing survivor networks to respond to the draft remit. The foundation launched a campaign calling for powers to compel witnesses, no voluntary testimonies that could be quietly avoided, access to sealed case files across all police forces and councils, inclusion of current cases to prove reforms were real, not just theoretical, survivor representation on the inquiry panel itself. Within a week, more than 100 survivors had signed an open letter endorsing those demands. Several national newspapers picked it up, putting additional pressure on ministers to respond. In private, Maggie knew some MPs were irritated by her tactics. One warned her bluntly, "You keep pushing like this, and they might pull the plug." She didn't blink. If the only way it goes ahead is watered down, it's not worth doing anyway. To her, this was the same fight she'd been in since Augusta, against a system that wanted control over how the truth was told. And just like back then, she had no intention of handing them that control. The inquiry might have been announced, but Maggie understood something the headlines didn't. An announcement was just a press conference. The real work, the dangerous, messy work, was still to come, and she was ready for it. The inquiry's first hearings began in a windowless conference center on the edge of London. Deliberately chosen, it seemed, to keep the press at arm's length. The room was lined with neat rows of chairs, a horseshoe of tables for the panel, and microphones that picked up every cough and shuffle. Felt sterile. But Maggie knew that once the survivors began speaking, the air would change. From the outset, she fought to get real survivor voices into those sessions. Not just lawyers reading prepared statements, but the women themselves, telling their stories in their own words. This was harder than it sounded. The inquiry's initial witness list leaned heavily on expert testimony: academics, safeguarding specialists, senior police officers. Survivors were relegated to a few token slots. Maggie pushed back hard. "If you don't hear from the people who lived this," she told the inquiry chair in a private meeting, "you're just rearranging paperwork." Her persistence paid off. Survivors backed by the foundation were given direct speaking time. Some chose to appear behind screens or with their identities protected. Others sat in full view, steadying themselves before describing the years they'd been ignored. One young woman's testimony stopped the room cold. She told how, at 13, she'd gone to a police station after a violent assault, only to be told she was probably drunk and regretting it. Her voice cracked as she described walking home alone that night, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. The panel members shifted uncomfortably. Maggie watched them closely, not to see if they were moved, but to see if they were listening. But while survivor voices reached the room, institutional maneuvering was already underway. Certain police forces, when summoned to give evidence, arrived with battalions of lawyers and meticulously prepared narratives that downplayed past failures. Some leaned on vague language, unfortunate oversights, resource constraints, misaligned priorities, phrases designed to smudge responsibility into a haze of bureaucratic inevitability. Others tried a more personal defense, framing the problem as the actions of a few bad officers rather than a systemic culture of disbelief. Maggie had seen this tactic before. It was the same dance from the Augusta days. Own just enough fault to appear cooperative, but never enough to change the structure. She countered it in two ways. First, by making sure survivor testimonies were rich in detail. Names, dates, locations, all documented so they couldn't be waved away as vague recollections. Second, by feeding the press. Quietly, off the record, she made sure journalists covering the hearings had the context they needed to cut through the official spin. The result was a steady drumbeat of headlines that kept the inquiry in the public eye, not as a polite bureaucratic exercise, but as a living, breathing confrontation with the truth. Privately, the pressure was building. Some police representatives were clearly uncomfortable being cross-examined in public. At one hearing, a former senior officer bristled when asked about decisions to close cases without interviewing key suspects. "It's easy to judge in hindsight," he said defensively. Maggie sat in the gallery, her expression unreadable. She'd learned long ago that sometimes silence, the kind that leaves a person alone with their own words, was more powerful than any outburst. As the first phase of the inquiry closed, Maggie knew they'd won only a small battle. Survivors' voices were now in the official record, yes, but the institutions were already trying to dilute their impact. The next challenge would be making sure those testimonies didn't get buried in a final report that read like a compromise. By the middle of the inquiry, the atmosphere had shifted. The polite opening statements and carefully crafted narratives were giving way to sharper questioning, leaked documents, and a creeping sense that some witnesses were not telling the full truth. Maggie had predicted this phase. "The closer you get to the heart of the problem," she told her team, "the more the system fights back." The first crack appeared in the form of a leaked internal email from a police force under scrutiny. Sent between senior officers during the inquiry's early sessions, It warned staff to be extremely cautious in testimony, to avoid admitting any operational failings that could be perceived as negligence. The implication was clear. This wasn't about truth, it was about damage control. A whistleblower passed the email to one of Maggie's journalist contacts, and within 48 hours, it was front-page news. The headline pulled no punches. Police email reveals grooming inquiry cover-up fears. The fallout was immediate. MPs demanded answers. The inquiry chair was forced to issue a public statement insisting that full cooperation from all institutions was expected. Maggie seized the moment. In interviews, she didn't just condemn the email. She used it as proof of what survivors had been saying all along, that institutions still prioritize their reputations over the safety of children. "This isn't a mistake from the past," she told one news anchor. "This is happening right now, during an inquiry that's supposed to be about transparency. If they can't tell the truth here, how can we trust them on the streets?" The leak also emboldened other insiders. Over the next few weeks, the Foundation began receiving tip-offs from within different police forces, snippets of case notes, anonymized safeguarding reports, even audio clips from internal meetings where senior figures discussed managing the narrative. Maggie treated each piece of information carefully. Some went straight to journalists. Others she held back, waiting for the right moment to present them in a way that would force the inquiry to address them publicly. Her bigger goal was now in sight, shaping the inquiry's recommendations so they couldn't be quietly ignored once the cameras were gone. She knew from bitter experience that most public inquiries ended with a thick report, a few days of headlines, and a handful of recommendations that were never legally binding. She wanted enforceable change, measures that would be written into law, not just polite suggestions. Working with her parliamentary allies, she drafted a survivor-centered safeguarding bill outline, designed to be ready the moment the inquiry concluded. It included statutory time limits for police to act on credible exploitation reports, mandatory survivor liaison officers for all grooming cases, annual public audits of safeguarding performance in each force, criminal liability for deliberate institutional cover-ups. She didn't expect the whole thing to pass unchanged, but she knew that having it ready would set the bar high, making it harder for ministers to settle for weak reforms. The mid-stage hearings were messy, tense exchanges, lawyers trading procedural jabs, survivors' accounts pushing the panel into visible discomfort. But that was exactly how Maggie wanted it. The fight was no longer just about what happened in the past. It was about forcing the country to decide whether it would keep letting the same failures happen again. As the inquiry entered its final phase, the stakes felt heavier than ever. The panel was moving into report-writing mode, sifting through thousands of pages of testimony, evidence, and institutional submissions. For Maggie, this was the most dangerous point. The quiet months where public attention drifted, and the risk of political sanitizing was at its highest. She'd seen it happen before. Reports that began as bold investigations often emerged as carefully worded compromises, blurring sharp truths into lessons learned platitudes. Survivors became case studies stripped of their urgency. Institutional failures became systemic challenges. This time, Maggie refused to let survivor testimony get buried in the footnotes. She started by organizing a survivor summit in Manchester, inviting every woman and man who had given evidence to the inquiry through her foundation. The aim wasn't just emotional solidarity, it was strategic. Together, they produced a joint statement demanding that the final report name the institutions and leaders responsible for major failings, include clear, measurable recommendations with deadlines, urge the government to adopt legally binding reforms, not voluntary guidelines. The statement was signed by over 200 survivors and sent to every MP and member of the inquiry panel. Maggie knew it would be politically uncomfortable, and that was the point. Meanwhile, whispers began to reach her from sympathetic contacts inside the Home Office. Certain sections of the draft report were being toned down after review by senior civil servants. Phrases like institutional neglect were reportedly being replaced with softer terms like service delivery gaps. Maggie moved fast. She spoke to trusted journalists, hinting, without breaching confidentiality, that she had concerns about attempts to weaken the report. Headlines soon followed. Campaigners fear grooming inquiry being sanitized. The inquiry panel, caught in the glare of public scrutiny, issued a formal denial, but the message was clear. They knew she was watching. In the final weeks before publication, Maggie focused on locking in political commitments. She met with MPs across the spectrum, pressing them to pledge support for implementing the recommendations in full. Some offered firm promises, others dodged. When one minister told her, "We have to balance ambition with practicality," she shot back. Practicality didn't protect a single one of these children. Ambition might. By the time the inquiry wrapped its hearings, Maggie had done everything she could. Survivor voices were in the record, media pressure was alive, and draft legislation was ready. Now, the outcome rested on whether the final report would reflect the truth, or the version of the truth the system could live with. Maggie braced herself. Whatever came out, she knew her fight wouldn't end with the report's release. In fact, it might only be beginning. The morning of the report's release broke cold and bright. Cameras clustered outside the government building where the inquiry chair would speak. Survivors gathered quietly nearby, some holding hands, others staring at the ground, braced for the words that would follow. Maggie stood among them, not on the podium but in the crowd, right where she wanted to be, shoulder to shoulder with the people the report was meant to serve. When the chair stepped up to deliver the findings, the language was sharper than many had expected. The report concluded that multiple police forces and local authorities had repeatedly failed to protect children from grooming gangs, and that those failures were not isolated mistakes, but systemic and repeated patterns of neglect. It named specific institutions and included damning case studies that mirrored testimony Maggie's foundation had submitted. Most crucially, the recommendations were time-bound and measurable. Deadlines for police response to exploitation reports, mandatory survivor liaison officers, and independent audits of safeguarding systems. It wasn't perfect. There were still areas where the language softened in ways Maggie recognized, but it was stronger than she'd feared. The political reaction was immediate. Opposition MPs called for urgent legislation to enshrine the recommendations in law. Some ministers expressed full commitment to implementing the changes, but others hedged, talking about further consultations and resource implications. Maggie knew what that meant. Delays. She didn't waste a second. That afternoon, she was on the steps of Parliament, flanked by survivors and allies, calling for the immediate adoption of every recommendation. Her voice was steady, but the steel was unmistakable. We have the truth in black and white. The question now is whether those in power have the courage to act on it. Survivors have waited long enough. The public response was overwhelming. Newspapers ran front pages with survivor quotes. Social media exploded with calls to #ImplementItAll. Donations to the Maggie Oliver Foundation surged as thousands of people signed up to support ongoing work. But Maggie was already thinking beyond the headlines. She knew the real fight would be in the months ahead, in parliamentary committees, budget negotiations, and the quiet corners of bureaucracy where good ideas went to die. Within weeks, she and her team launched the Accountability Tracker, an online tool that monitored every police force, council, and government department named in the report. It showed in real time which recommendations had been acted on and which were still being ignored. Journalists loved it, so did survivors, and predictably certain officials hated it. One police spokesperson accused her of undermining confidence in public institutions. Maggie's reply was swift. Confidence without accountability is just complacency. In the months that followed, Maggie became a fixture in policy discussions, media panels, and grassroots meetings. The foundation grew, expanding its support services and continuing to push for reforms far beyond the scope of the inquiry. She knew the work would never truly be finished. Not as long as there were still children at risk, cases mishandled, or truths left untold. But she also knew something else. The fight had outgrown her alone. It was now a movement, one that no single institution could quietly silence. Standing at the Foundation's small office one evening, surrounded by case files, campaign posters, and a dozen volunteers laughing over takeaway cartons, Maggie paused. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was proof that persistence could turn a single voice into a chorus loud enough to be heard in the halls of power. And for Maggie Oliver, that was reason enough to keep going.